Yes, sure. So our second session is about statistical models for animal movements, and is organized by Alessio Pollice of the University of Bari. To you, Alessio.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you to all the speakers and the audience. We have 3 speakers for this session on animal movements, as Monica was saying. The first speaker is Mevin Hooten from the University of Texas at Austin, and he's going to speak about animal movement models with mechanistic selection functions. Please, Mevin, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Let me try to share my screen and make sure that works. I'm assuming you can see this slide now. Can you see the slide at full screen?
Sure. Yes. Yes, we do.
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. So let me get started right away. I think I have a total of 25 minutes. Is that right? And leaving some time for questions?
That's right.
Okay, great. First of all, I just wanted to say thanks for organizing the meeting. TIES is one of my favorite meetings. Sad that it's not in person, but this will have to suffice this year. And thanks for organizing the session too. Let's see, this is an interesting sort of fusion of different ideas. This isn't one of my traditional sort of presentations on animal movement, but I think hopefully something will be interesting to everybody here in one way or another. So this is a sort of presentation on how to fit animal movement models that have more mechanistically meaningful underpinnings. And we try to keep it as simple as we can in terms of the implementation procedure, but having some deeper mathematical connections than we would normally use. And so that's how I'll work through this talk today. What we see on the right here is a inferred movie associated with the spread of sea otters in Glacier Bay in Alaska. And it's been part of a long coming sort of recolonization of this region by sea otters. And what we've used to model that population level movement process is a statistical implementation of partial differential equations, or PDEs. And so that'll play a role, that concept will play a role. So I'll swap back and forth between individual level movement models and population level movement models today. In fact, you know, one of the ways that this has made sense to me in the past is to organize these different thoughts about individual-based movement modeling in the same way that we would organize the topics in a spatial statistics format, where there's a point process perspective, a continuous process perspective, and a discrete process perspective. Today, I'll focus mainly on the point process perspective to it, but in this other context, like I said, with this sort of background notion of what's happening in terms of the physics associated with the movement and spread of organisms over space and time. So again, just so that we're clear, I'll start with a point process perspective. And the beginning of the presentation here will focus mainly on a review of that for folks who might not use this stuff every day. Okay, so we should be seeing a slide here that says, here's some introductory material on spatio-temporal point processes. This is just one of many ways to write these, but it's sort of a standard way to write it in the animal movement modeling world. And, you know, throughout this talk, I have several references, but not to say that by any stretch, those are the only references that are relevant for a lot of these topics. There's been numerous developments in this area, way too many to be able to cite all in one place. So here's how it works. If you can see my pointer okay, there is a model. We'd like to model the positions of these individuals. Let's start with one individual at a time, and we'll call that S vector here, indexed at time t for some observation index I. And it arises from some stochastic generating process that we represent here with the bracket notation. So think of it as a PDF for S. And the idea is that PDF could be expressed in a variety of ways, down here, we have the weighted distribution perspective for it and the point process sort of context. And there would be both spatial distribution and then a temporal dynamic associated with that. The spatial, what's often referred to as the selection component of this model, but these models tend to have a product of two functions, right? One is G and one is F. The spatial component handles the selection of resources by individuals. Again, their position indexed by S, and then the environment that they're moving around in indexed or represented here by X. These parameters, beta, we tend to want to infer, and they tell us something about how individuals are selecting resources differentially from what is available to them at any given time. The availability component of the model is usually handled by this F. And I'm sorry if this is coming off as really elementary. It's just I want to make sure everybody's on board here. So this component of the model here, F, there's a variety of ways to handle that and to model that, and that's been done in several different ways over the years. And so I won't focus as much on that today, although what you'll see is that we'll get a natural version of that comes out of all this too. And then, of course, this distribution, these two functions, G and F in the numerator here are non-negative. And so their product is non-negative, and they need to be properly normalized to serve as a PDF in space and time for this individual trajectory position. Okay, so that's how it works. How do we fit these things to data? Well, there tends to be a variety of ways to do it. You could use numerical integration to solve that integral in the denominator of that PDF, which you'd have to evaluate numerous times in an implementation. And again, these things are all well known in the point process world and also in animal movement world. The alternative perspectives have been more common, to be honest, especially in animal movement modeling, where in particular, this second one, the logistic regression approach, it's easier described than it is written out in words. But basically, you would think about your positions where you observed the individual in time and denote those by ones, and then you would augment the data set with a large number of zeros. If it's a dynamic spatial point process like this one, you would augment each time step with a set of zeros. As the number of zeros gets large, they'd be drawn from a background. This background sample would be drawn from an availability distribution like I showed on the previous slide. And as it gets large, the approximation to the point process model becomes more accurate. And that's the perspective I'll talk about next and how that's done. Maybe it's a little bit easier to see graphically how this might work. So let's think about an individual animal representing a species, let's say the mountain lion here in North America, where you can see sort of a cutaway map here, a set of positions of this mountain lion and its movement over a week or two. And obviously it walks around in this region of space through this background topography here and ends up kind of back where it started. The idea here behind the implementation of most space-time point process models, again, we're just sort of reviewing background here, is that you would, as the individual is moving around in this space here, blown up in this region on the left, these circles would represent the availability region. And it's not so much that that's the only choice of how we would deal with the availability distribution, but it's a common one because it's relatively easy to sample from a circle whose radius is controlled by some pre-estimation of movement distance that would be typical for that particular time step, given the amount of time that's elapsed. And that's often how it's done. So in effect, it's like a uniform distribution that's assumed here in space associated with availability. So where we would draw from that distribution to get the background sample. And that's what's usually done. Not to say it's not the only way, and there's been many, many developments in this area using this approach. The cool thing is that you could sample from that availability distribution, and then you could apply the rest of the model kind of in a two-stage analysis, and that's often what's done. You could do it all simultaneously too, and folks have done that as well. But today I'll focus on that latter, the former approach, and I'll explain how that works. So where does all this go? What does the statistical model look like for it? Well, if we want to learn about the effects of selection related to certain underlying characteristics of the environment, like these simple ones here, based on the topography, you could have things like elevation be affecting the movement of mountain lions or slope or the solar exposure, et cetera. And we'd like to learn about the parameters that influence that. So to do that, we would build a model that utilizes those sort of contrived binary data I described earlier, where these data are now yi, j for each step I, and think about it as almost a replicate j, but the j index is really more about the availability. The first element of each of these yi, so yi1 would be equal to 1, and the rest of them would be equal to 0 for each step. Then that arises from a Bernoulli with probably p, where that's linked to some underlying environmental variables, x, and then the parameters of interest, beta, that tell us something about the differential selection. This all implies there's an availability function g, and it looks like this, an exponential of x beta. Okay, so that's kind of how the model looks like. The only difference here between this and the space-time world and just the spatial point process is that it's got these step-specific intercepts beta, not I. And if you used all that and you built a likelihood, this is what it would look like down here in the bottom. The only problem with this likelihood is it doesn't admit that there's a constraint here, that there's only a single, for every step, only a single one in the data set, the binary data set, and the rest are zeros. And so to deal with that, the traditional approach, this is all the sort of convention, is that a person would say, okay, let's impose this constraint that the sum for each step of these yij's is equal to 1, because there's a single 1 in the place denoting where the animal actually moved, and the 0 is denoting where the animal could have moved at any given time. You place that into a likelihood and simplify, and what you end up with is what's called this conditional logistic regression likelihood. And the beauty of this is it doesn't involve those intercepts. And that simplifies this likelihood quite a bit. And there's a variety of software that you can use to fit these. And that's what, by and large, that's what 90% of animal ecologists would use to do what's called a step selection analysis, which is really an approximation to the space-time point process itself. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say about background. Now here comes the part of the talk where I say, okay, how can we think about this from a more mechanistic perspective? And that's where I'm going to next. So let's consider this situation I showed you a movie of on the first slide, where sea otters have been colonizing Glacier Bay. This is in Alaska. Glacier Bay is a large national park and an area where sea otters are conserved and managed effectively. And so the National Park Service flies surveys where they would detect sea otters using a variety of methods. This is one of them with aerial photography data. They would count them, and then they would use those counts in a statistical model to help us learn about the spread of sea otters over space and time. And one way we've done that is think about y here, totally different y than the last one, but think about y here as being a count time t in some survey region, script SI, would arise from maybe, for example, a binomial that has an underlying abundance process NT and some detection probability phi, and that NT arises from, let's say, a Poisson process underneath that has an integrated intensity. That intensity is the dynamic, the space-time dynamic process of interest. And so we could think about the dynamics and expressing those in terms of a PDE associated with this dynamic process P. So P is the PDE, and this represents effectively population intensity at any given space and time. So this is a population or an Eulerian movement model, and we've used these to great effect over the years. And I think they're really powerful because they involve the mechanistic dynamics. Let me talk about the PDE itself, just for folks who aren't used to looking at PDEs. So this is obviously there's a temporal derivative on the left, and then you got these partials on the right associated with space. Inside those partials, you get these product of these two terms. P is the process itself. That's what moves the sea otters around in space and time. Delta is the diffusion coefficient. And that's really the key here. That diffusion coefficient is what spreads things around. And of course, you know, folks have used, including us, have used many more complicated versions of these PDEs to handle things like advection and reaction, if it's necessary for handling the characteristics of the population that we're studying. So imagine now, delta is what we want to learn about. Those are effectively, think about them as motilities, movement rates in space, and maybe even in time. Okay, the key is this is called the Fokker-Planck equation. This is a version of it. The delta on the inside allows for very realistic models for animal movement, as opposed to a simplified version of the PDE where you would have a plane diffusion or Fickian style diffusion with the derivative either, with the diffusion coefficient either being between derivatives or outside of them. These things, this Fokker-Planck equation tends to be pretty numerically intractable to solve. You can solve it, but the problem with trying to solve it is that it requires a much finer resolution in the numerical solution than these other simplified equations. So mathematicians are hard at work at finding better ways to get good approximations to the solution for this equation, and one of which involves something called homogenization, which we've used quite a bit. And that is that, think about a simplified version or an averaged version of the process that we're trying to study. Let's call that U. So it's still a dynamic process in the space, but it happens at a larger scale. The important dynamic happens at a larger scale than the one we're interested in. We can write this, we can derive this diffusion equation based on a method of multiple scales, or homogenization technique that applied mathematicians use quite a bit. And what happens when we do that with that Fokker-Planck equation is we end up with diffusion now on the outside of these two spatial derivatives, and that creates a much smoother, easier to solve, coarser scale numerical solution to this PDE of interest. What's really neat about it is there's two things. Delta bar is actually a harmonic average in space, and so of the original diffusion coefficients. And so that has some really interesting statistical properties. It's kind of a downscaling method in a way. And then the even better thing, and this is where it gets really relevant, is that we can recover the full high resolution version, or an approximate version of it, the high resolution version of our process of interest, P, by simply dividing U, this smooth, coarse process, by its diffusion coefficients at the fine scale. So just for visual perspective, we've got a coarse scale up here for, let's call it delta bar, and then the fine scale right here, that's delta. Now that by itself is really powerful for modeling space-time processes. And like I said, we've used it over and over for populations, but how does it relate to the individual level? Well, here's kind of where this comes into play. One other thing you can do with this homogenized version, if you think about this PDE from a point source solution, it could serve also as a point process model, a PDF basically, for our trajectory data S at time t, where we can write the model for S at time t now that we would like to use for telemetry data as this proportional to, at least, this function on the right. Now, if you squint at this function on the right, what you see is that, in fact, there's really a product of two functions, one of which is G, and it looks like this. It's basically proportional to the inverse of the diffusion coefficients delta, and the other one is F, and that one we can call availability. So we have a selection function and an availability function that arise naturally from a point source solution or fundamental solution to the what's called the EDE, the ecological diffusion equation, that one I showed before, the Fokker-Planck equation. So delta relates to some underlying movement probability psi, and we could then link psi to the underlying environmental information X. The cool thing about this is that the delta bar ends up in the availability function, and that can really be easily estimated using a variogram type technique, a temporal moving average. And then G contains the high resolution version of delta, and both of those can be directly linked to underlying covariates that we might use. Okay, so this is where all the action happens, is on this slide. where does it, how does this come into play when we try to implement this? And how simple can we get the implementation so that it could be used by a variety of users, not just by statisticians? Well, let's think about that conditional regression equation perspective I showed earlier, where we now map all of our data into zeros and ones in the same way that I defined before, where a single one is associated with this yi j for the j equals 1 case when the individual occurs at a specific location and we observe it there. And then all these yij's would be zeros when they arise from a background availability distribution that I showed on the previous slide. I should note on that previous slide, notice that this is just a Gaussian kernel down here. It's just scaled by the difference in time here. So that's useful. That's easy to simulate from. Okay, what changes here is it's still just a form of logistic regression, but we get a nonlinear link function over here that we can plug in anything we want. I hadn't known this before. Maybe folks who deal with conditional logistic regression know that this works. I did not know that this works, and so I was fascinated to learn this. That in fact, you can put any, in our case, any selection function you want in for G, which means we can put the selection function in relative to the diffusion equation that we had before. And you can find the likelihood, and you can simplify it down to this conditional likelihood that's very similar to what's used day in and day out. The only problem is you can't just use the regular conditional logistic regression software to do it, because this G is not just going to be e to the x beta. It will be some other function that's implied by our PDE. But that's fine. You can just do it, and it's not that difficult to maximize that, or to fit you know what we would have done would fit this all in a Bayesian framework and use MCMC. Okay, so what do we get out of it? Well, we can get inference on these coefficients just like we would do in a traditional resource selection function context. And I'll tell you about that in a second. We can also learn about these what you could think of as derived quantities. Psi is movement probability, so how fast, how much we'd expect the individual to be moving in a region of space. And then similarly, we could get at this residence time, which is, I think, really where this gets more mechanistically related, is when we start thinking about how long individuals are lingering in various areas and why. These are all easy to get through the output of the model itself. And so what does it mean, for example? Well, let's take this solar exposure coefficient for a second over here on the right. It's basically saying that we're seeing a positive coefficient, which would imply as the solar exposure increases, the movement probability also increases. But because that's inversely related to residence time, it means that as solar exposure increases, the individual mountain lion will linger longer in areas where there is less solar exposure. And so that gives us some feel of movement associated with the Fokker-Planck PDE that we wouldn't normally get out of the resource selection approach when we use the more standard link function in there. Okay, so we can also, last thing I want to show you is we can also map these quantities, psi and r, and I'll do that on the next slide, where on the left here we have psi, which is a movement probability, and it's just shaded in the background based on the movement probability itself. And then on the right, you can see the inverse of that effectively, which is the residence time and how long the individual is lingering in certain regions of space. This schematic at the top gives you a feel for how the model is using the data. The background sample is shown at these red locations here, and those are saying, okay, here's what's available to the individual if it were positioned at this green location at the previous time, and it actually moves to this blue triangle at the next time. And so that conditional logistic regression approach uses those data and that understanding of where it moved, or where it could have moved versus where it actually did, to infer all these quantities. So I think with that, I'm pretty much out of time. Let me just hit the last slide here and just say again that these are a few of our references related to this work, but of course there's so many others that folks have done, including some of the folks that are on the conference today. And that's all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me ask if there are questions from the floor. if there are not, I'll probably keep my curiosity for personal questions and go on to the next speaker, just to keep with the time schedule of the session.